Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom. Giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Bashem, Yahweh Shai, Bashem, Makakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Word Millstone for teaching us his truth and citations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. And listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick. And Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I actually wanted to do a response to a lesson that was done by one of my elder brothers, Shammai, within my camp, and I was so moved by the lesson itself. You know, what I'll do is I'll attach the link of that lesson in my description, right? So you'll find a link in the description box. But I was so moved by, a few points that he made, and one of the points that really stuck out to me that I also wanted to expound on, and I wanted to do a response to it, was the idea of abasing and abounding. And that's something that Paul talks about, in the book of Philippians, right? And it's something it's very interesting too, because the Lord will have us in moments where, we are abased. But, in terms of leadership, the Lord also have us in situations where, we are abounding. So, sometimes, you might be sought after, for some kind of counsel or some type of understanding within your own realm or measure, so to speak, right? And not to be able to shy away from it, because, these things, would happen, right? Not to say that it's wrong to be somebody, I'll say it like this, not to just desire, to be in a leadership sense, to be a head of a camp or whatever. But, within your own measure, sometimes for you to be able to lead, and take the basically how they say it in the world, take the bull by the horn, sometimes that's also needed, right? Because the scriptures talk about how, wisdom that is hoarded up, what profit is in them both, right? Treasures that is hoarded up, wisdom that is let me see if I can find that. Actually, I didn't have that written down. Let me see if I find that. Let me see if I find that real quick. Let's see here. Sirach. I believe that's 20. 13 and 20 or 20 and 30? Okay, here it is. Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus chapter 20, verse 30, and it says here, wisdom that is hid and treasure that is hoarded up, what profit is in them both, right? So there is no profit in hoarding up, wisdom, right? So it's meant to actually, this is something that it's actually needed. It's actually, just for us and our own understanding. But sometimes the Lord will put us in situations where, you give in your 2 cents, so to speak, in regards to certain situations. Maybe you might be around brothers, or you might be what's the word I'm looking for? You might be around non-believers as well, right? And they might inquire, and then it's then that's the time where you basically I don't want to say flex your sword, but basically, you unsheath your sword. I should say it like that, And I'm speaking from experience as well, because, that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this as well, because I'm the type of person, for brothers that actually know me, I'm not the type of person that likes to talk a lot. I'm very, very to myself. I'm just more of a listener. I tend to be more on that abased, type of mindset. But, the constantly, I was always being put in situations from not just within my own camp, but within my own flock, so to speak, where, I had to be able to speak and expound on certain things, right? Have to give counsel in regards to certain things. And who do you, in the ancient times, when you think about who was sought after in terms of counsel, it was the prophets, right? As a matter of fact, let me get this here. Actually, I want to get two precepts. Just bear with me on this. Sirach 4. Where is it? 3, 4. Sirach 4. Sirach chapter 4, verse 10. And it says here, be as a father unto the fatherless, and instead of a husband unto their mother, so shalt thou be as the son of the Most High, Yahweh Bashinel Shai, and he shall love thee more than thy mother doth, right? So, essentially the prophet is an example of a father unto a fatherless nation, right? So there are examples, like when you think about what a father does, a father is able to, watch over, their children, and making sure that, they basically, they're basically taken care of, right? They're not hanging around people that they're not supposed to, they're staying away from dangers, he sets boundaries, right? So think of it in that sense, right? Okay, kind of be able to give them that instruction of what's right, what is wrong, right? When you think about, and a good example of that is when you read the book of Tobit, Tobit, being a righteous man within captivity, he was basically giving his son that counsel, that guidance in regards to what his son should do and what his son shouldn't do, not just when he's alive, but when he's dead. So basically, as the scriptures talk about how he's basically, Tobias, his son, is basically becoming a duplicate copy, right? So we're all mini duplicate copies in the spirit, like Yahweh Shai, when you think about it, because we're taking on that same vibration, right? And this is something I also wanted to get, what also very much moved me to actually do this lesson as well, in terms of abasing and abounding, is what the brother strongly, touched on. This is Luke chapter 22, verse 24. And it says, and the title, it says, who is the greatest? And it says, and there was also a strife among them, which of them should be accounted the greatest. And he said unto them, Yahushua speaking, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and they that exercise authority upon them are called benefactors. And it says, but ye shall not be so, Yahushua speaking. But he that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger. And he that is a chief, as he that doth serve. For whether is greater, he that sitteth at meat, or he that serveth? Is not he that sitteth at meat, but I am among you as he that serveth. Let me get that last one. Let me read that last two in the Amplified, and it says, but it is not to be this way with you. On the contrary, the one who is greatest among you must be like the youngest, and the least privileged, and the one who is the leader like the servant. For who is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? It is not the one who reclines at the table, but I am among as one who serves, right? So it's a mentality, right? Of being, and understanding servitude. And then Yahushua actually showed us that example when he washed the disciples' feet, right? He showed us that example. So that is it's a mentality, because we're not as, because that's the way the heathens think. The way the heathens think is contrary, is much like they constantly try to exercise that lordship, over the people and be basically as tyrants, because they don't understand that they have a how do you call it, a superior within the heavens, right? They don't understand that because their gods are a bunch of idols, right? But we know the Lord, basically Yahweh Bashim Shai, made the heavens, right? So we understand, just like how we are among those who serve it, we understand that we have a leader, within the heavens, right? So it's a bit of a balance, to it. And this is something I strongly try to emphasize and maintain, especially in the workplace, because sometimes, again, sometimes you will be thrown into situations that calls you to be a leader, giving advice on certain things. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but I've had situations where I had to give counsel to one of my parents in regards to certain situations. They were dealing with certain situations, so to help them to understand the spiritual aspect of basically suffering, right? And that was a huge, because that was a huge thing for them, because we grew up in the Catholic Church, and that was understanding that was never actually given to us. That was actually ever explained to us, because we've been so calcified in thinking we don't actually see the spiritual realm of things. But when people, that's what the prophets are really supposed to be designed to do, was to give our people the spiritual explanations in regards to certain matters, right? So that is one of those examples where you might be called to be a leader within your own realm, within your own space, so to speak. It may not be as a head of a camp, but it might be with like somebody that you might just dwell with. It might be with an unbeliever. It might be with a younger brother. You know what I'm saying? It's don't leave that possibility off the table. That's the point I'm really trying to make, right? Let me see here. Let me get another one here in Proverbs. And I want to get a few, maybe like one or two accounts on leadership, right? Let me get this here. Proverbs. No, that's not it. Just bear with me 1 second. State. Oh, here it is. Okay, Proverbs 27 verse 23, and it says, "Be thou diligent to know the state of thy flocks, and look well to thy herds," right? So, looking to making sure that, within that little capacity, if you have a capacity to know the mind frame of your own, flock, so to speak, knowing that, how they're doing, right? So that is somebody who's basically like an overseer, right? But just like, in the physical sense, how you have a shepherd who overlooks the welfare and the state of their sheep, right? In human context, you have that, amongst, ourselves as well. We have our own heads that look, that basically look over us, right? But you might have that in your own capacity, right? It may not be a parent, right? It could probably be maybe a relative. It could be a family member that you dwell with. It could be, somebody that you spend a lot of close quarters with. Maybe they're unbelievers, but they need counsel from you in regards to certain situations, and they don't have that, right? The scriptures talk about. Let me get it actually. I think it's in Ezra somewhere, about how I've given you leaders. Second Ezra 1, verse 39, and it says here, unto whom I will give for leaders Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Oseas, which is Hosea, Amos, Micaias, Joel, Abdias, Jonas, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Aggeus or Haggai, Zachary or Zechariah, Malachi, which is called also an angel of the Lord, right? So these are really and truly our leaders, right? And the prophets, are back here, again. You know what I'm saying? So they're the ones given that spiritual understanding in giving our people, that spiritual food, to give them that counsel and understanding in regards to certain situations, right? Because the upper, how would you call it? The people who our people associate as leaders cannot expound spiritual ideas, right? The carnal man is basically cannot receive the things of the spirit, to roughly paraphrase what Paul ultimately said, right? So really and truly, the prophets are really the ones that are actually our leaders, because they were leading our people back to the Lord, Yahweh Bashem Shai, so they can get an understanding of why certain things are taking place, right? So so that was one of the points I wanted to hit. Another point I also wanted to hit to kind of add to this lesson was insecurity, right? Because, and I'm speaking from experience as well, for brothers that know me specifically, like I'm not the type of person, again, that likes to speak a lot, right? But, and I remember when I first came into the camp, I still used to stand on the other side, right, rather than standing in front of camera, and it it was something that I constantly had to work on and overcome, and throughout Yahweh Bashem Shai for be able to help me. But sometimes we have certain insecurities that we have to basically meditate on and try to overcome, right? So I wanted to get this here. Not to be basically over consumed by your insecurities, right? Even though Moses said, like, Lord, I'm not eloquent, right? The Lord still said to him, like, yeah, I will be in thy mouth, right? To roughly paraphrase Moses, you know what I'm saying? So I wanted to read this and not to basically not make his mistake. You know what I'm saying? This is 1 Samuel chapter 10. This is verse 17. And I want to read it in the AMP, right? So the title here, it says, Saul publicly chosen king, right? And it says, Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah in the Amplified. And it says, verse 18, and he said to Israel, thus saith the Lord Yahweh Power, God of Israel, it was I who brought Israel from Egypt and rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, from all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected the Most High, who himself saved you from all your disasters and distresses, and yet you have said, no, set us a king over us. So basically, Israel, Jake is asking for a king, right? They want somebody like a, to be that, like a figurehead, so to speak, to rule over them. And it says, now then, present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your families. And it says, and when Samuel brought the tribes of Israel near, the tribes of Benjamin were chosen by Lot. And the point's in verse 22, and it says, then he brought the tribe of Benjamin, this is dealing with King Saul, he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by the families, and the families of Matri was chosen by Lot, and the Saul, the son of Kish, was chosen by Lot. And when they looked for him, he could not be found. Verse 22, here's the point. And it says here, so they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? And the Lord answered, he is there, hiding himself behind the provisions and supplies. So they ran and took him from there, and he stood among the people, for he was taller than of the people from his shoulders upward. Right? So here it is that King Saul, he's been, chosen, to be the king, right? But, when they were looking for him, he was hiding among the stuff, right? He's hiding behind some provisions and supplies, right? So, he has the stature. So it describes him from, he has basically prominent, shoulders. But basically when the Lord, chose him to be king, he didn't basically walk, step into that role. He basically hid himself, right? And that's something, you don't want to do. You don't want to hide yourself. That's a mistake. Even looking within myself, like that was some of the things, that was a mistake that I made, right? Not to basically let your flesh, and your own insecurities kind of hold you back, but allow the Spirit of the Lord to kind of like drive you, forward, right? Because we all have them, right? It's not just, we all have our own issues and own insecurities that, we had to overcome. For me, it was just more of that, I don't want to say introversion. I would say more like, I'm not much of a talker, so to speak, right? So, being able to, being put in a position to basically convey a message, right? Because sometimes it might be time for you to actually speak, right? So that's what a leader does. A leader is able to, speak and convey messages and basically, make things plain, basically, make things plain upon tables, right? So, that's the point. The Lord will put us within certain situations to overcome a lot of these insecurities, right? But this was something, as Saul, was chosen to be the king, he hid himself, right? And it shows that he had the stature, because if you think about it, in a sense, if you thought about it, like, for example, in a carnal sense, how is it that a person has that kind of, mindset? You have broad shoulders. So I'm guessing, he probably was a very, very tall, right? And people, we know, when you think about our people, and even back then, we were probably very, we were a lot taller than, the way we are now. But the point is, like, here's this tall guy. How is this guy, showing such insecurity? It doesn't make any sense, right? And it shows you the very sharp contrast between someone like David and then someone like Saul, right? So it doesn't really make a difference, in terms of physical stature, right? But allowing that Spirit of the Lord to be able to not to be held back by, your insecurities, but, allowing the Lord, to be able to put you in situations so you overcome these certain insecurities, right? Not to be dwelling in them, not to be overcome by them, to fight, basically overcome these things, right? Okay, so that was the next point. Now, the last point I wanted to hit, I guess actually it's kind of more of an account in regards to leadership, and, basically how the Lord will put us in situations, that demands that counsel, right? And I'm speaking from, and I gave my 2 cents, my experience. So this is, let me just look for it 1 second. Okay, I won't read all of it. I'll kind of just jump around just to make a quick point. Let me just read the beginning and I'll jump down. This is Genesis chapter 41, verse 14, and it says, Joseph interprets, and it says, and then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph and brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst interpret the dream, can understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered the Pharaoh, saying, it is not me, the Most High Yahweh Bashmel shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace, right? So, Joseph had this gift, and, it was, the Pharaoh basically has this dream, and, he wants to be given understanding in regards to, what's going on, right? So I want to jump down. So basically this chapter basically goes into the ins and outs of Pharaoh's dream, right? But I kind of want to get more to the point where Joseph basically is giving the Pharaoh, right? Keep in mind that this is Pharaoh. This is not like a cobbler making shoes or a fisherman, right? This is somebody who's advising a king here on what he should do, right? So sometimes, I'm just using this as an example to show Joseph's leadership, right, in giving counsel, because sometimes mentally prepare that these things can also happen of you, right? And not to think of yourself so lowly, right? Yes, we're humble, but don't to think of yourself lowly, right? This is I want to jump down here. I want to jump down to verse 33. So this is basically Joseph giving the Pharaoh the counsel. And it says, now therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint officers over the land, and take up 1/5 of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And it says, and let them gather all the food of those good years to come. So Joseph basically, he's explaining the dream. Okay, you're going to have 7 years of good harvest, plenteous of crops, good corn, whatever, right? And you're going to have, 7 years of, it's going to be like famine, basically, right? Verse 35, and it says, let them gather the food of those years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And the food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine. So it serves up basically as a buffer when that time of famine comes. And it shall be when in the land of Egypt that the land perish not through famine, right? So they'll be able to make it through the time of a lack of abundance, right? That's what a famine is, right? You don't have soil growing. You don't have crops growing. There's a shortage of, because that's how people lived back in the ancient times. It was mostly we lived more closer to the land. It wasn't like the way we think about cities today with you have your local 7-Eleven and all that. You don't have that. You didn't have that back then, right? So it says here, verse 37, and it says that the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And it says, and Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as that this is a man in whom the spirit of the Most High is? Because Joseph is glowing. He's glowing in the spirit, right? And it says, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as the Most High showed thee all this, that there is none so discreet as thou and wise as thou art, thou shalt be over my house according to thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne I will be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took his ring and of his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck and made him ride in the second chariot which he had, cried before him, bow the knee, make him ruler over the land of Egypt. So basically Joseph at this point, being able to interpret the Pharaoh's dream, he was given favor over, the land of Egypt because he had that counsel, he had that wisdom from Yahweh Bashem Shai, he had that skill to be able to, interpret dreams and so on and so forth, right? Just like how we have our own, skills, and, scriptures talk about how wisdom maketh a man's, face to shine, right? So in those situations, these things, mentally understand that these things can happen, right? And not to think of yourself, remain humble, yes, but not to think of yourself lowly, right? Because these things can happen whether you're amongst non-believers. It can happen, within, like, on a job, so to speak. It can happen, it can happen anywhere, right? Because we when the scriptures talk about how a man is known by his walk, right? So people know, even though they may not be able to put their finger on it, they know that there's a certain type of glow, about you, right? So, this is not to, and this is another thing, I guess I'll leave off with this last point as well, not to basically, also not to be a tyrant as well, because that is something that, can it can be susceptible to, if not careful, right? You don't want to be basically like a lion, in your house, right? Because scriptures talk about how knowledge can also, puff up, right? That's why I wanted to hit that example Yahweh Shai talked about, being like a servant, right? Because when you understand and you're able to, when you have that servitude mindset, it really keeps you in a mindset of administering, unto another, and especially in times of need, right? Because these things help you to keep you more, grounded, so to speak. You don't have a puffed up mindset, but you have a mindset of servitude, right? Because sometimes those situations can happen. You might be in a situation where, you have to help out, a brother in, a particular way, or, sometimes it could be a family member also who's not able to fully help themselves in a particular way, but they're very, very still pleased to dwell with you. So you try and help them out in the best way that you can, right? We shine as lights in the world, as Paul said, right? And this world is it basically gross darkness. So that's pretty much all I had. I didn't want to make the lesson too long, but I wanted to just hit those things, not to get too puffed up, with the wisdom, maintaining that servitude mindset, not to let insecurities like hold you back, but being able to put yourself in situations that help to push you forward, so those things don't actually weigh you down in the spirit, right? So that's pretty much the point. But Lord's will, this lesson was quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem El Shai, Bashem Makakwadash. Double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone. Until next time, I say Shalom.